Right, good morning. Welcome to the Property Investors Show. This will be the best panel you attend, obviously, although there is one after, and I'm going to say exactly the same thing at 1 o'clock to the people that are in the room then. So this is a panel of experts, as they all are. And this is quite a kind of specific, quite a focused subject matter, really. The subject of permitted development. Now, I'm going to get somebody on the panel, I'll pick someone in a minute, to actually explain what permitted development is. To me, it's a kind of shortcut. It's a bypass, really, when it comes to development, and particularly for those seeking to convert something commercial into residential in a slightly easier way, obviously, particularly with a view to either selling that development on or indeed keeping it as a buy-to-let investment. So that's what we're going to be talking about. What I love, and most of these guys love, Ritchie definitely does, is a bit of audience participation. So, comments, I was going to say argument, but let's say if you disagree with something that we're saying, feel free to speak up. And certainly questions, because although we've got some questions and the panel will kind of expand on a lot of those questions, what we really want to ensure is that you, as the audience that are here to kind of glean information and knowledge, actually walk away in an hour's time with that knowledge. So obviously it's very much a question of what you want us to talk about. So if there's anything burning in terms of the how-to or the upside of this or the downside of that or whatever, please feel free to put your hand up. And I might just pick on a few people if you don't anyway. So just to keep it nice and interactive. Come on in, guys. Feel free to sit at the front. Cheers. Most people never want to do that, do they? But it's always the front that, these two guys are brave, but most people always leave the front seats.
It's a comedy show, so we're going to get picked.
Yeah, we might get something thrown at you, depending on how this goes. Right, so look, let's do intros first of all. So I'm Russell Quirk. I've been given the dubious task of chairing this panel. I'm a property guy. I'm a very, very small landlord, so I've got a couple of properties. My history is estate agency, bit of house building, and I was chairman of the planning committee at my local council for a number of years, so I've kind of done the private sector, public sector bit, and I do a bit of media commentating on the housing market. I'm famously an optimist when it comes to the housing market. I don't believe all this rubbish about the housing market crashing and how we're going to see 35% drops in values across Britain. People have been saying that for months, in fact years, and it hasn't happened, and I don't think it ever will. So, but yeah, we can maybe talk about that as part of this debate. But let's go through the panel and get them to introduce themselves. Which way should we go? Should we go from Romy first? Romy, tell us about who you are and why you're here.
Okay, hi. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, everyone. My name's Romy Chopra. I'm founder and CEO of the Chopra Property Group. We run I'm effectively a HMO landlord for many years and then moved into development about 7-8 years ago. I'm also a care home operator. I'm a pharmacist by background in my early days.
Is there anything you don't do, Romy?
We've in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, we've been doing a lot of commercial to residential conversions, which is probably why we're here today. And in terms of why we're here, really just to explain, moving from a landlord to a developer is quite an interesting transition, and for a lot of people, it's quite a big leap. So hopefully, anyone in the room who's looking to maybe move more in that direction into development, and particularly more commercial-based development, is quite a different animal to residential. So I'm happy to sort of help people through that process and answer any questions. Manny, my wife and life partner, works with me. She's the boss, and I just do the back end stuff. But
you do what you're told.
I'm doing what I'm told, yes. Yeah,
so, Manny, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, the thing is, the better half of Chopra Property Group. But yeah, I think we've got different roles in the company. My role is very much in the beginning of the process, where I'm looking to work with investors. I find the deals, secure the deals, acquire them, and then he takes over and does his technical stuff on it. So it sort of works quite well.
So you have specific roles that you define within the business, and you've gone through the permitted development process yourself
a few times, and we're in it right now.
Yeah.
So it's a great
the practical kind of voice of experience here. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
So ask us questions, guys.
Yeah, and a man that needs no introduction, Ritchie Clapson.
Well, I also need an introduction. Ritchie Clapson, I'm a chartered structural engineer by profession. I've been in this industry now just over 40 years. I know what you're thinking. Doesn't look like it, does it?
Looks like 60.
You weren't thinking that, okay. I've been around a long time in the business, working in development, a fairly high level, invited by the government to peer review Olympic Stadium, National Aquatics and Velodrome in 2012. Retired 13 years ago. What do I do in my retirement? I actually just train property developers, both existing developers to do it better and brand new ones to actually get into the industry. I've got a company called PropertyCEO, that's what I do these days.
Because funnily enough, it's not just buy a bit of land and lay some bricks and try and sell it. There's a bit more structure and strategy to that, apparently.
Well, fundamentally, it's do not buy land.
Right, okay.
That might come up as a
Well,
question.
let's talk about that. James, over to you. Last but not least.
Hi everyone, James Hutchison. I'm a chartered plan consultant, chartered town planner. About 20 years ago to the month, actually, I started off in planning in the local authority sector. I worked in that for around 10 to 12 years, and then went to work for a London planning consultancy before setting up Corbil Planning, which is my own consultancy. That was 2016, and been working away on various different projects, London, South East mostly, but elsewhere as well, for about 8 years now.
Great. So, James, because of your planning experience, you're probably best qualified, although everybody is, but you're probably best qualified to explain exactly what permitted development is. Maybe a little bit of history, because obviously it's fairly new. You know, it wasn't something that existed, let's say, 20 years ago. So maybe talk us through what it is and I guess kind of how it works in kind of top level terms, if you don't mind.
Sure, okay. So in essence, it's what is development. So development is any building operation or any change of use. And that means that anything you do, putting a window into a building, put a door into a building, would need plan permission if everything that's development required plan permission. Now, obviously, that's a very, would exhaust all local authorities, would be very time consuming. So the government gives away what's called permitted development rights, which allows people to carry out changes of use and building operations up to a certain prescribed level without the need to go to the planners and local authority and get plan permission. So those are called permitted development rights, and those sort of ebb and flow over time on a political whim, depending on what the government wants to do. Sometimes they tighten them, sometimes they relax them, sometimes they change them all around, and sometimes they limit permitted development rights through what's called prior approval, which is the giving away of rights but the withholding of some control over it. Yeah. That is in essence what permitted development rights are.
And I think particularly today we're talking about the conversion from commercial, so whether that's retail, industrial or predominantly office buildings, into residential. So let's talk about that in a bit more detail then. Maybe Romy and Manny, can you give us some examples, let's say, of something that you've come across as a project that was, let's say, 10,000 square feet of office building in the middle of a town centre. How did you find it? What did you do with it? You converted it through permitted development. What was the outcome? Maybe you can give us a kind of 5 minutes whistle-stop journey through that process.
Okay, so I recently, about a year ago, as you probably know, a lot of the retail banks are closing themselves down. So I quite like bank buildings. They're quite interesting, always in good locations and typically close to high streets. So that's how it caught my eye. I purchased a bank building in Henley-upon-Thames, a nice part of the world, by the river. It was a former Lloyd's bank building. Had been there for 50, 60 years, or thereabouts. It was probably around about just under 10,000 square feet of space.
And it was freehold.
It was a freehold purchase.
Because of course you could buy a leasehold building, a long lease, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm sort of always, I tend to go freehold. I just think it gives us a little bit more freedom to do stuff effectively, particularly when it comes to doing development. So we went down the traditional commercial agent route. I managed to develop a good relationship with the agent in the town centre. And I think that's important because invariably you've got to build up that trust relationship because they get a lot of tie kickers through the door. So you go in there, you sort of say, right, this is what I want, this is what I committed. And that took the process. He showed me a lot of stuff beforehand and eventually he said, I've got something. It wasn't even on the market. So the bank had already been closed for about 6 or 8 months. It was owned by a group of guys. And so they sort of, he said, okay, this is coming up. I said, great. I looked at it, I said, yeah, I want it, definitely.
And he showed you because of the relationship that you'd built, which is very important, I think, and not just the relationship and the schmoozing, whatever you want to call it, but also establishing that you've got credibility.
Absolutely, yeah. So they want to make sure that you're not just all talk. There is substance behind that. So do you have the financial
Please
means
do come in, guys. There's
to make that?
some spare chairs over here.
So one of the other things I then decided to do was find a local planning consultant in the area, knowing in just to establish that PD was definitely going to be an option. Because
sorry, did you do that before you closed on the deal?
Yes,
the deal?
I did it simultaneously, in fact, because obviously I knew there was going to be some discussion and negotiation, as there is with any purchase. So that's sort of, I knew that was going to probably be a 4 to 6 week process. So as soon as I got some traction, I then decided to then look upon getting a local planning consultant. Found a very, very good lady with an established track record, knew Henley very, very well, and she sort of went through it. And she said, I've gone through. The great thing about it, she went through the history of the building right back to the 50s and 60s, because sometimes you can get caught out with restrictive covenants and all sorts of things in that, and that's why you need
specialist advice.
Specialist advice,
Even if it doesn't need to go through the proper planning process.
Correct. So she said, look, as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing in there that I feel is going to restrict you from getting permitted development on this building, established use, commercial, etc., all the relevant caveats. So, and the thing is, the building had already had a partial conversion done into residential several years earlier. So, so there's sort of so there'd already been some sort of, in principle, something had already been done on the building. So we went along and applied for permitted development, and obviously for those with permitted development, you have what they call a 56-day process.
So you still have to apply, even though it's permitted.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So there is a process. So you go through that process, and there's as long as you sort of, and there are
the checklist as well.
The checklist, yeah, absolutely. So there are certain processes there, and I'm sure we can go into that in detail a bit later on. So once we've done that, you sit down, and this is sort of Christmas period. So my 56-day, the whole thing about the 56 days is that they have to give you an answer by day 56. If they don't, it's deemed permitted, which
So
means
you get it by default.
you get it by default. Exactly.
Okay, interesting.
Which is exactly what happened in my case, because in Henley there were a lot of people there that were not happy about seeing the bank go. It's quite a historic building. It's a bit of a landmark building, and so I knew there was going to be a little bit of local opposition from the councillors and a few other people who were making some noise in the background. So the Henley Herald had made some little comment in the local newspaper saying,
Okay, so I know we're labouring this a bit. I know Ritchie's busting to kind of get in here, but I think this is really important so that we all understand exactly how this process works. So, permitted development, you think that just means you can buy a building and just turn it into 50 flats, but clearly it's much more process-driven than that.
Absolutely.
And you can still come up against the challenge of objection from local people and also from local councillors.
So tell them about
So
it.
essentially what happened was, although we got, the 56 days was sort of just at and as far as I was concerned, I got a call from the planning consultant and said, 56 days have passed, deemed permitted, happy days.
So you serve them a notice, presumably.
So and then what happened was, this is 27th, 28th of December where the offices are closed. We then get an email back from them on the 4th of January when they open up the office and say, sorry, by the way, our systems went down. We'd actually rejected your application on the 20th of December, but our IT systems, and for that reason...
But we didn't tell you.
But the rejection message didn't get through to your portal. Now, thankfully, what we did was we took screenshots of everything on the date. It's very important that you have the evidence to support that. They were still playing hardball with me, so I rang up Laura and she says, I think we're going to have to get a barrister involved.
Right.
Which was incredible.
Well, let's run to the end of this, because I generally could talk about this all day, but obviously
so we got a barrister involved. Just to say in a very quick nutshell, by getting the barrister involved, that quickly turned into, do apologise, sorry about our mistake, and to get an apology from the council. I've got it framed, right? Seriously, right?
in the toilet where it belongs.
Yeah, exactly. So long story short, we got it, and then we got it out. And so in a sense,
So what did you build?
So I built three flats, two bedroom, one bedroom, and two one-bedroom flats. And downstairs, I've actually created a commercial space which I'm going to operate through myself. I'm basically, my brother's a dentist. We're going to open up a dental practice and a few other bits and pieces.
So are you keeping the flats upstairs?
We're keeping the flats at the moment. I'm sort of toying with the idea. Someone's offered to buy them.
Yeah.
So just, I'm in that negotiation phase. Give me a number that I like,
Yeah.
and then we'll talk.
Right, so Ritchie, let's talk about the economics of this. So how well did he do you think, on the basis that this was permitted development rather than having to buy something that needed planning permission? Do you think there's an advantage, or do you think that advantage is now already priced into permitted development projects?
I think it can be, okay. Office conversions are very, very well known, and the pricing gets put in by those commercial agents that believe there's extra value in those buildings.
They expect you to do it.
There's a whole raft of buildings. So banks, as Roman says, is one of them. Offices, gymnasiums, light industrial, cafes, restaurants. There's a whole raft of these. And savvy commercial agents will obviously be saying to their vendor, there's permitted development rights on this, we can price it in. Unfortunately, any agents in the room, by the way?
One. Very brave putting your hand up there.
Present company accepted.
Yes.
But many of them do not understand how to stack a deal. So they actually say to their vendor, they raise those expectations that it's worth this amount of money, and often it isn't. So that does get priced in. What you've always got to look for is those areas that perhaps are less understood. Okay, the shops and uppers is so well understood. You can get deals. What Romy did there, though, is got it off market. Okay, and the one thing I would say, one bit of advice, if you're out there trying to do development, don't bother with Rightmove, Zoopla, Estates Gazette, because 50% of the deals don't come to the market. They come through relationships as these folks build.
And even the ones that come to market, you're competing with dozens, if not hundreds of other people that also think it's a great idea to buy that project.
Well, you're competing with people that aren't what I would say seasoned developers, because everything gets passed through a seasoned developer, generally in the first instance.
Can I just ask, Ritchie, is there anyone in the room that's got a project kind of that is in their lap, on their desk, right at this very minute? So you're sitting there either toying with something or something that you've bought that you intend to be a permitted development project? Anybody? No, right, okay. So you're all anticipating based on what these guys are going to tell you. So rushing out later on, presumably, and trying to find some opportunities. Okay, good. And the reason I ask is because if you had something in the offing, then obviously we could talk very specifically to help you with that particular project. Ritchie, sorry.
I do have some questions because I'm looking into some office buildings. My problem is I do architecture, and my clients are looking into central London locations. So I have a couple of questions here. First is Article 4 direction.
This sounds like one for James, by the way.
We should look for if we.
And what is that? Sorry, what is Article 4? I don't even know what that is.
Well, it's kind of.
Do you want James to explain?
Yes,
James,
Putting him on the spot. What if he doesn't know? That would be funny.
if you want to come around the seats over there.
Yeah, please come and sit down.
If some councils are very worried, and they were very worried when particularly Class MA came in, they stuck what's called an Article 4 direction on geographic areas. Some tried to put it on the whole borough, others selected
There's seats here.
high street commercial locations, which means that if an Article 4 direction exists over that area, it means that any commercial property or anything that's specified in that Article 4 cannot change use. So it basically rules out your Class MA permitted development rights.
Okay.
Class 4 is Article 4 is also different. Like you can either have a HMO restriction on Article. So it's different types of Article 4.
Got it. So what are your questions? Sorry, specifically.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's an answer. The second question is listed buildings, which by itself they need planning permission, but then for certain parts of the listed buildings, but change of use, let's say commercial to resi. Do you think that's?
So you say there's a conflict there. So the building might not need planning permission, but it does if it's listed.
Yes.
So how do you navigate that? I guess is the
It
question.
doesn't need planning permission, and this man will tell you why.
It does need.
It does need planning
It
permission.
No, it doesn't.
Yes.
Listed buildings need planning.
Conflict on the panel. This is
No,
good.
no.
He's right. It's changed.
It's not changed. It's been the same quite a while.
I'm going to have to break up a fight in a minute, but just bear with us.
Yeah,
Yeah, it is.
Class MA is restricted, but Class G isn't.
Class G isn't, no.
Yeah, Class G is the
Class-
only
class-
one. Class G is the only
So I've got
one.
one in Bicester at the moment, which is Class. You're right. Sorry.
I'm right. Hey,
Harmony is
Ritchie's
broken.
quite correct.
He's
Yeah.
partly correct, but Class MA you can't. You have listed buildings, you need planning permission.
Yeah.
I think, does everyone understand what Class MA and Class G means?
No, can we
There you
explain?
go. Please explain.
do you want me to explain? You can explain.
Go on, Richie. You explain.
Okay, so we have a number of permitted development rights that we can convert buildings with. Did you use Class MA on the bank? Yeah. So we have. It's very complex because we have use classes of buildings, okay, which are various letters, and then we have permitted development rights, which the government has sought to put it as letters as well, just to confuse the hell out of us. Okay. What you want is a use class E building, use class E, okay, and that is, come on sit down, please.
There's spare seats.
That will be the banks, the restaurants, the cafes. There's a long list. Okay, we can give you what they are. Anything in use class E, we have two permitted development rights that we can use. One is called MA, one is called Class G. There are others. You can convert barns. There's Class Q. There's lots of stuff out there. Okay, but Class MA can be used on all use class E buildings. Okay. And you can convert those into residential. There are various restrictions around them. At the moment, a 1,500 square metre limit. There's also, it's got to be vacant at the moment for 3 months. It's got to be in that use for 2 years. So there's certain restrictions around MA. Class G is who's heard of shops and uppers, so that type of expression? Yeah, a few people. Well, that's often referred to as Class G. It's actually now commercial units. So all of those banks, restaurants, etc., you can use permitted development right Class G. And if you've got a commercial unit on the ground floor, you can actually put residential units above. Okay, that's the only permitted development right that applies in listed buildings. So to actually convert the use, and when we're talking about changing a building, there's the change of use from the building. That was require planning permission. And as James mentioned earlier, there's the change of anything visual on the building, putting windows in, changing the roof, even painting the wall a different colour. So Class G, permitted development right Class G, enables you to do a listed building and convert the upper floors to residential. If you want a little tip and trick, you can actually use it to convert the ground floor to residential, can't you?
I've heard of that. In some local authority, they might allow you by claiming that it's a split floor.
Let's just ask the question back. Does this help you in terms of what you're looking
Just
for
to
your
add to that,
client?
though, listed building consent is a separate legislation. So Ritchie's quite correct. Class G, you don't need. You can do Class G on a listed building. As soon as you go and do any work, and that's internal as well, you will need listed building consent to do that work. So if you're changing doors around, putting stub walls up, things like that, you will still need to get the listed building consent from the council. But as Ritchie explained,
But you put in two separate applications, because we realized that for PD you still have to put the application, so you're not just going to do, so it's two separate.
they're all restricted. Yeah.
And I think we're starting to get a sense of the fact that permitted development is not quite as quick, easy, and straightforward as the term, might denote. It's certainly not the silver bullet, by the sounds of it, Manny, is it? That
Well, I think
we'd like it to be.
Councils are opposing it. They're really trying to push back. But at the end of the day, it's in law. So if you meet the criteria, so for example, contamination, floods, space standards, daylight, sunlight, you have to provide certain survey reports and stuff like that. And if you meet all the criteria and the checklist they've given you, then by law they have to give it to you.
Yeah, and later on we will talk about the politics of this. I mean, no one can second guess what's going to happen in the general election in 12, 13, 14 months' time, although I think we're starting to see what's going to happen there. But we will try and speculate what might happen if an incoming Labour government gets into power where PD is concerned.
There's a new consultation by Michael Gove, which ended on the 25th of September, and that's making...
Will he ignore that one like he ignores most consultations?
Well, apparently on this one, they're very keen to get it approved. So the consultation obviously ended, but now it's being discussed in the House of Commons, and effectively for Class MA, which is what Ritchie described earlier, they're trying to remove the vacancy period.
Yeah.
So there won't be a 3-month vacancy rule, which is right now. When you do Class MA, it has to have been vacant for 3 months.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the checklist, the computer will say no. And the 1,500 square meters, there are either two options on that. They're either going to double it to 3,000 square meters, which is all buildings up to 30,000 square feet, or they might just abolish the size criteria completely.
And have these rules, since permitted development was introduced, have these rules constantly changed? I mean, it sounds as though that there is real ambiguity actually as a consequence of different changes of housing minister, secretaries of state and so on. So, I mean, again, the message I think here, and this is not a sell by the way, but is that if you're going to go down the road of a permitted development project, you really need good
a planning consultant,
advice.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
You might think you know everything, but there might be something, and there are lots of different hidden things, like for example, SIL.
Yeah. Yes.
Typically, SIL, which is the Community Infrastructure Levy, is not payable on permitted development applications. However, in certain cases it is. So for example, we're looking at an office building right now to convert into residential. So it is Class MA, but SIL is going to be payable on that one because...
Which has to come off your bottom line, right?
Yes.
Massively. It's between 75 to 150 pounds per square metre of SIL.
Yeah.
But the reason being, if your office building or the shop or whatever, it's not being in use for continuous period of 6 months in the last 3 years when you do the application, SIL will be applied.
Right, I see.
So you've got to be very careful, and you have to make sure your planning consultant knows exactly what they're doing. So
Yeah, very important.
they're worth their weight in gold.
Pearls of wisdom from Louise. Yes, go on.
No, just a question. Initially for Manny and Romy, and then to the rest of the panel as well. 56 days. So 2 questions. 56 days. Is that non-working days or just working days? And then secondly, had you not got it by default, your planning permission on your bank in Henley, what troubles or what avenues could the local authority have pursued in terms of making life a lot more difficult for you? So first of all, 56 days, and then life being more difficult.
So 56 is working days.
Working days.
Yeah.
8 weeks.
Calendar.
I think it's all of it actually.
So it could be,
Sorry, it's
Yeah.
calendar days.
Is it calendar days? Sorry,
It's
my apologies,
calendar
calendar days, yeah. second point regarding, had we got a refusal, and they had, is that the question you're asking? If we got a refusal, so if we got a refusal, you look at the reason for refusal, right? So even when we got the refusal, albeit they're trying to backdate it, their reason for refusal was nonsense.
Well, no, they had a reason. You want to share the reason?
The reason was nonsense, complete nonsense. Because the planning consultant said it doesn't, and that's the reason.
It'd be interesting to know what it was.
The reason
and then
was
whether that complied with
well, it's
So-
quite technical.
It's technical, but basically, when we bought the freehold of the Henley Bank, part of the building was already converted into 4 flats and sold on long leaseholds.
Right.
So what they were saying and what their reason was that it's already residential.
Oh, it's already
therefore
consumed
commercial.
your PD rights.
Correct.
Kind of
Well,
thing.
sort of, yeah.
They're saying it won't apply because you already have flats in there.
But
So
the-
it's technically it's not commercial.
No,
And if they give you a reason for refusal, do you then have to take it through the standard appeal process as you would if it was a planning application?
Yes.
Which can take months.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, but because technically, and that because they were saying it was still one building, but they were actually separated. The 2 buildings were in fact separate, albeit it was existing as one freehold. There's 2 separate entrances, so that's the reason why when the barrister looked at it and broke it down, she said they've got no case here. She then presented case law, 3 or 4 previous cases, and said, be my guest if you want to go with it, but be prepared to pay some significant damages to my client. And within 2 hours, the letter came back with the apology after that point.
That's just what you need.
Wow.
But they will use anything in their, to actually come and push back on the
just another point as well, just on that, just there's a couple of points I want to say. As regards to that, like I said, I mentioned with the newspaper, because what happened is, this is what happens, the local newspaper actually put a letter out in the internet to say that our application had been rejected before we even knew about it. All right. So I wrote to the editor, basically once we won the case, I went back to the editor, I said, well, we're going to sue for libel. And he said, look, if you do that, you're going to shut our newspaper down. But when you do open, we're going to give you free publicity. We'll go and get the mayor. We'll cut the ribbon. So I said, okay, we'll work on that one, possibly. So I've just got to say, sometimes what you do is they'll do that, and then suddenly you work that to your advantage, sort of thing. So, and then going back to, just one last question, because obviously I think it's important. Based on relationships, just on this particular bank, and the reason why I'm going off market is they will give you what they call a guide price on the property. Yeah. So I'm a bit blunt when it comes to that. So guide price means that's what I'm going to pay you. And the agent kept saying, no, that's the guide. We're looking to accept. So they're looking for 30% more than the guide price. Just to let you know, at the end of it, I only paid the guide price. Okay. So it just goes to show that when you go into this, you've got to play a bit hardball. You play with your numbers and you work it through. Although they had other clients who were looking to pay more, built up that relationship with the vendor, and he said, you know what, I like you, I want to sell it to you. So that's also important, I think, when you do negotiations.
Right, so we've kind of ventured into some of the downsides, the complications, I suppose, of permitted development, and I think we've established that it's not quite the kind of, as I say, the kind of magic bullet that some might think it is. But what about advantages? Let's be positive, shall we, Ritchie? So what are the absolute advantages of permitted development, notwithstanding all the things that we just talked about in terms of the hurdles and challenges?
Well, if we actually, what we're comparing it against, okay, so it might not be
A standard application.
the silver bullet, but if we compare it against a standard planning application.
And the risk that goes with that.
Yeah. So a standard planning application is going to be 8 weeks or 13 weeks,
Lucky.
if you're lucky.
Well, 8 or 12 weeks from validation,
Okay, but
and
it
often they'll
could-
take 2 or 3 months to validate.
But
right?
it could be months and months and months. I heard about one the other day, 22 months, okay? And the problem is, Manny was talking about there's a tick list, okay? It's about half a dozen or so items, and the rules are black and white in the permitted development rights. Class MA and Class G are the easiest ones. Who would have heard of airspace rights? Anyone heard of airspace rights? Yeah. Don't do that, okay? Don't bother with that. It's two shades of grey in it. What we want is the easier route, and the Class MA and the Class G are relatively black and white in their tick box. By comparison, if you're going for a planning application, there are rules, okay? It can't be subject to emotion. It can't be subject to the neighbours all kicking off, which neighbours always kick off about car parking, don't they? That's a common thing, car parking, okay? But there can't be emotion. It's got to be based on planning law against local and national policy. The trouble is, local and national policy is written to give the local planning officer control, and they can force all sorts of things at you. Particularly, so for the bank, did you have any car parking in the bank? So they might better force, in certain areas, car parking under planning, amenity, garden space, and various other things. Or they might just say, under our local policy, we want this as an employment area, in which case you are refused under policy XYZ clause 72.3416X, whatever it could be. That's the sort of thing they do. So they've got huge control over you. So the advantage of permitted development rights is when you get a planning consultant on board, he or she can look at it and go, yeah, you've got your half a dozen boxes, it's black and white. Have you got contamination? Yes or no. Have you got flooding? Yes or no. Can you get adequate natural light? Yes or no. And so these things are
But there are less boxes you need to tick.
Well, there are less boxes, and there's less ambiguity around those boxes. And a planning application is nothing about boxes. It's all about a huge amount of policy. And we've then got that 56-day default rule that we can apply. So, yes, it's not as easy, but stick to G and MA, because that's your path of least resistance. But by comparison to the alternative, it is so much easier. It is so much easier.
Despite what we've been saying, Manny?
I think actually it's a huge opportunity right now for commercial to residential. Class MA is only going one way, which is basically they're extending it even further. Hopefully by January 2024, this consultation will be accepted, or parts of it will be accepted. As we know, with commercial buildings, there's a huge opportunity now with businesses obviously struggling.
I was going to say there's presumably some market-led reasons that commercial now has become cheaper and therefore is more attractive from the point of view of taking something that's commercial and turning it into residential.
And the Conservative government are definitely very keen to make sure, because obviously they're being beaten about the fact that the houses are not being built, enough houses. So they are looking to use this particular permitted development
to make up the numbers,
to create more housing.
Yeah.
This is what they want to do, because obviously countryside, is, all those are no-go areas.
Yeah.
This is the only way they can make things better.
Okay. Well, let's talk, as I hinted at just now, the future. If we can kind of gaze into our crystal balls. James, from a planning perspective, what do you think a Labour government might do where permitted development is concerned? I mean, Manny makes a really good point that PD was introduced to kind of almost fudge the numbers, frankly. If you're not building enough homes as a government, which no government's done since Macmillan, by the way, which is the 1950s, if you're only building 150 to 160,000 homes a year on a previous target of 300,000 homes, you need PD to make up the numbers. So can we be fairly confident that Keir Starmer and whoever is his housing secretary is going to keep permitted development rights? Or do you think that it might be one of those things, and I don't want to get too political here, that the left of centre decide is not the right thing to do? Have you got any feeling, any sense?
I think it's well publicised that the Conservatives are giving away more in permitted development than has ever happened before. I mean, if I look back to when I started planning, the things that you can do now, we talked a lot about residential conversions. I mean, even extensions to domestic housing. I mean, talking about 8-metre extensions. They're massive giveaways that the Conservative government have given, and that's not going to happen under a Labour government. They're traditionally going to try and restrict permitted development rights.
Because they can still be contentious, as we talked about. Planning, unfortunately, is very political. It seems even with permitted development rights. So
if you look in, a lot of Labour-controlled sort of inner urban areas, PD's heavily restricted. There's a lot that your Class MA's gone, your Class L's gone. HMO's it's heavily restricted within a lot of sort of traditionally Labour areas. And I don't think that permitted development rights are always going to be around. They've been around for years. They're not going to disappear overnight. But
you think they'll be reduced? They'll shrink?
I think the prior approval process will get screws put on it.
Yeah.
And some of the giveaways, maybe what we have with the Class MA. What happened before Class MA came in was that all the use classes got amalgamated into what Ritchie referred to as Class E. And that was a massive change. That's not happened in 30, 40 years of planning, where you got the amalgamation. It was inevitable it was going to happen once all those use classes were amalgamated into Class E.
Yeah.
The Class MA was going to follow, and of course it came along about a year later.
What I worry about, there's obviously been some pretty bad press about permitted development over the years, particularly around this very, very small example of developers turning ultra small units into residential, whereby bedrooms are 4 foot by 3 foot and they've got no window and so on. So that, from a headline perspective, might make a Labour government that's coming in say, well, that's not fair on the public, so therefore we're going to ban that. Although they are also going to have the pressure to make sure that enough houses are built. So I think this could end up being quite a political football. I mean, do you agree? Do you think that might happen?
I think the standards have raised. I think one of the things that we also we've just had a change of building standards. SAP 10 is a new regulation that came out in September, July 22, June 22 last year. What that means is that, as you know, that whenever you build something, you have to get signed off by building control, and there's certain standards that you need to follow. And I think in the past, some of those standards have now been raised quite significantly. So I think one of the things you've got to realise now, every application I'm putting in now, whether it's PD or planning or otherwise, some of the things now, climate's become a big play. So they're going to start looking at now, you've got situations now where you can't put gas in properties anymore. You might need to import, you might need to reduce the CO2 footprint of the property. So there's a lot of caveats that are coming in. I think if you're looking to go into conversion, I think you've got to be a responsible developer. You need to embrace that. And if you want to sort of develop relationships with the councils, because there's such a raft of changes taking place, a lot of people are struggling to keep up with the raft of changes. So if you are in the know, your chances are when you sit in that room, you're probably the most well-versed person in the room, whether it be a consultant or otherwise.
But in the next 12 months, in the run-up to the election, as unfortunately we get political parties kind of throwing tidbits at the public from an electioneering perspective, you're going to see more changes, unfortunately. And again, we can't predict what those things are going to be, but I do think it's going to be.
Well, I think the housing market is very, very important for the United Kingdom, because it's something that's it's embedded within the
culture.
DNA.
Within DNA, we have that culture of buying. The UK, more than anyone in Europe, has a culture of buying property more than renting. But
do you think also politicians, and I hate to labour the political thing, but obviously, look, we are in kind of electioneering territory now. Do you think that some politicians, whether it be left or right, see permitted development as something that people do as landlords that then profit to the detriment of tenants? I've sat on panels like this in the past where there's been kind of tenant activists in the room that have, in fact, Paul, I think you might have been at one that actually had a load of activists outside that were protesting and complaining about landlords being evil, nasty, horrible people.
Absolutely.
So if that translates into politics, that will be another reason, of course, potentially, why any incoming government says, well, actually, if PD benefits these nasty landlords, albeit we all know in this room that those landlords are benefiting tenants by providing choice, stock, and so on, what would happen if all the landlords disappeared? Politicians need to think about that for a second. But again, I worry that this narrative, this headline grabbing, is going to be to the detriment of permitted development rights being shrunk effectively in the future.
100%. I mean, literally, all you hear on the radio now is greedy landlords, greedy developers. You've taken a buy to let, somebody else could have bought that house to live in them themselves.
Which doesn't happen, by the way. It's rubbish.
That's all you hear on the radio. And with Labour coming, I think that is all the more reason that the next 12 to 18 months is even more important by using the permitted development rights right now. Because they might be shrunk, they might not. We don't have a crystal ball, but there's a huge chance that will be, because they're definitely leftist, and that's what their policies are normally.
Ritchie.
I don't think they will.
You don't think they'll shrink them?
No, I think you have to look at the underlying issue of what's going on. I mean, there was who's heard of the nitrate issue that's been going on?
Yes.
Okay.
The house
very,
builders,
very political. I've been writing on that. I've been commenting on that on LBC and things. And that's a real political sham where Labour blocked it in the House of Lords. And maybe the Conservatives were pushing it through. So if I just sit right down the middle of no political view, the problem was that actually the nitrate issue, which is the discharge of sewage into our rivers, has really got nothing to do with housing. Housing contributes about 1%.
It's the water companies.
It's the water companies. And so it's a bigger issue. But underlying all of this, so politics will come in, and no doubt, like any new politics coming in, or a managing director taking over a company, change for change's sake. What I think they'll do, they'll tighten up the rules, they'll play around with the rules to make it look like they've done something. But what we need to understand in this country is we are falling short of the housing that we need, 150,000 houses. And if you want to take that overview, the reason that rents are so high is we don't have enough housing stock. So they're always going to be high.
And the numbers are, this week, 35% fewer rental properties on the market now compared to 2019. Yeah. So supply has shrunk, demand's increased.
So let me just finish this statement, and Luke, I see your hand up, we'll come to you in a second. So what I would say there is that we have to deliver more housing. Any government, however they dress it up, however they oppose, because they're always going to oppose the current view, has to deliver more housing. And then if we think about the environmental impact, because everyone's going to be associated with the environmental impact, permitted development converts brownfield land. It converts existing building. It's not building in the greenbelt. And so if we look at that nitrate issue, those buildings would originally discharge into the rivers and streams. So that all ticks those boxes.
It should be less contentious.
So it is less contentious. And I think if a change of government comes, it will be dressed up in a different way. They'll do a few other things, but they can't ignore permitted development rights. Because the other thing is that if we then understand the other underlying thing, the 300,000 houses that are supposed to be delivered, a third of the housing stock in this country used to be delivered like people by use, like small scale developers. People were delivering 5 to 20 units. That's down to 12 or less than 12%. And the government or any government need small scale developers to come back, because Barratt's, Persimmon, Bellway aren't interested in converting that bank into half a dozen apartments.
But this does all assume that governments think these things through, which in my experience they don't do.
But they still have to deliver the housing though, don't
Yeah,
they?
true. James?
That's a very good point, and it's.
They're getting on now. It's great.
It relates to what's happened to housing land supply, and I mentioned this, to Ritchie when we talked to Ritchie about this separately. The housing land supply is basically the councils being required to deliver a certain number of housing. It's
5
their
years?
housing requirement, their 5-year housing land
Yeah.
supply. The Conservatives have talked about reducing or relaxing the pressures on local authority to meet that requirement. They're also talking about local authorities not actually having to look at their green belt in terms of provision of housing. All that is putting more of a constraint on how 5-year housing land supply is generally what gets you the big developments on the outside of your towns and your villages. If you relax that, the developments to meet the 300,000 homes has got to go somewhere. And that is the extra relaxation, trying to provide it in a different way.
And then you end up with an assault on the green belt, which is also politically undesirable.
Yeah, so it's very much not just a permitted development issue, it's what's happening overall.
It has unintended consequences. Louise, you had a question? Right?
No, it was just more a point on the politicking thing. I mean, I heard on Radio 4 this morning, now the Green Party want tenants, I mean, it's not just strictly development, but also landlords, want tenants to have the rights to force their landlords to put in insulation. I mean,
Wow.
So just
Thank goodness the Green Party will never take government. Ever.
I know that in reality there's not a risk of that, but it just feels as though it's just all the headline grabbing stuff and to be seen to be doing stuff, and it's always the developers on the landlords seem to take the hit.
Yeah. Anyone in the audience got any burning questions or comments, sir?
Josh.
Yeah.
I was just wondering about the panel's comments around actually purchasing properties. What kind of strategy do they do? Obviously.
What tips, you mean?
Well, yeah, just a general kind of comments. Obviously, ideally, a vendor wants cash purchase. That's the ideal. However, as developers, that is not ideal for us. But obviously, in certain cases, it's at the bottom of the pile, and then obviously there's a lot of competition and whatnot. So
Yeah.
just kind of general comments from the panel around that.
Yeah, so specifically around financing.
More the purchase, finance, the purchasing, the kind of interaction, maybe where people have found, interactions more beneficial, maybe certain interactions less beneficial.
Yeah. So it is the question, how do you put yourself as a buyer in the best position to buy what you want?
Yeah, if you wanted to sum it up, that's probably.
Yeah. Remy?
I think
you talked a little bit about relationships, so we've kind of, we've discussed that.
I
how
think
do you do that?
the challenge, I think, at the moment is meeting vendor expectations. That's the biggest challenge you have, because the vendor will say, "This is my asset, and I feel it has this intrinsic value." And what you've got to do is to sort of go, work out either there's so many different creative strategies you have today. Whether it's because sometimes in order for you to get permitted development or a planning, that's where you're going to get the enhanced value on that asset, right? So if you've got a building where okay, I can make 6 flats out of it, that's where you're going to get the intrinsic add value. But see, as I said, and obviously the problem is today with permitted development is that a lot of the agents particularly have already, as Ritchie said earlier, have already put that into the vendor's mind to think, well, okay, you can get another.
Well, they've priced it in because no agent is going to encourage a seller to leave loads of money on the table.
But I think the thing is now with the myriad of there's so many changes now, and this is why I advise everybody in this room to really get and understand and educate themselves about the system, the whole Class C, the different class systems, the different myriads of that, and there's a lot there. But the more you know, it puts you in a better position, because I'll be honest with you, there's a lot of agents out there, no disrespect to yourself, who don't actually understand and can't be bothered to learn the new stuff. So a lot of the time they'll see a building. The key in this game is you see something that 99 times out of 10 nobody else can see. that's where you're going to get the intrinsic value straight away. So you've got to go in there as a discerning buyer because you know what your end game is. They're seeing it as a block. You're seeing it as 8 units or whatever the case may be. So you've got to know how to slice and dice something. The key in this is the sum of the parts is always going to be more than the whole, and you've got to work out, do your numbers. I'm a big believer in reverse engineering. I go in there with saying, I know what I want, I know work back, and then I know what I'm going to pay for it. And then put all the relevant contingencies in place, because with every development you do, there are always going to be challenges and problems along the way.
Of course. And Manny, what else can you do? I mean, seriously,
I'd say-
what can you do to put yourself in pole position over above somebody else?
I'd say become an expert in your area, so know exactly what sort of numbers people are asking. And so if you see an opportunity which is slightly less below market value, you know exactly it's below market value, you go for it. But also, more importantly, work with investors. I'd say build up those long-term relationships, go to your local networking events, and genuinely work with other people and learn from other people, but also build up those relationships so you can have proof of funds. So one of the buildings we bought back in 2021, when the market was on a very, very high, it was only going one way up, and we had about 10 other bids that we were competing with. The reason why we secured that office to resi in High Wycombe was because my joint venture partner had a good relationship with the agent, but more than that, we had proof of funds that we could show them.
But if you're a first-time purchaser of something, whether it needs planning permission or it's a permitted development project, how on earth do you prove track record when you haven't got one? How do you do that for everybody in the room that's
work
never
with a
done
joint
this?
venture partner on your first deal who's got a property resume that you can actually, show off and say, look, we are working together. This is my property joint venture partner. This is the project we've done. So go on the back of someone. As they say, other people leveraging. Leverage is a massive thing in property.
Yeah,
Whether
that makes
that's
sense.
time, money, experience, knowledge, what have you.
Richie, tips?
I wouldn't work with a joint venture partner just because what I
More
would
disagreement
say-
on the panel.
No, I like a bit of that because I'd say it's very dangerous. You're working with someone else. You're giving half the profit away. You don't need to give half the profit away. And if you work with a joint venture partner, you are joint and severally liable for all the money that you borrow. So if they run off, you could get caught out. I think the most important thing with those agents, and I'll tell you how you build that reputation. One is rapport. Okay.
Which is what Romy was
So
talking
Romy was
about.
talking about. They built that relationship. The guy said, or the girl said, "I want to sell it to you." Okay, rapport. You can't underestimate how important that is. Price is important, but what supersedes price is proceedability. Okay, there's no point in someone coming along saying, "I'll give you £1 million for that building," but they can't proceed. So you need to demonstrate proceedability. A lot of that is proof of funds, that you have got that cash available, whether you joint venture with private investors, but actually they're just coming as a loan agreement. I'd rather it do it that way. And then you've got a decision in principle from commercial funders. It's how you present yourself, okay? So let me give you an extreme example. It doesn't matter whether you've never done this before. It's about how you get that credibility. If Richard Branson, to the best of my knowledge, he's not a property developer, but if he wanted to become a property developer, he would assemble the best team around him. He'd have people like James in his team and so on, and he would actually demonstrate he was proceedable, that he had the money. And if he rocked up, people would give him credibility. And it wouldn't necessarily be the best price. They want to work with him and it's proceedability. Now you might say, well, that's Richard Branson. Of course he demonstrates that. But what does he demonstrate? He demonstrates his ability as a business person, his success in other areas. What you have to look at is, what is your track record in life? What else have you done? It's how you package that up and present that forward to an agent.
But have it ready to go, not something that you have to be asked for 3 or 4 weeks later that you then cobble together.
If
It needs to be
you're asked,
packaged,
if you
right?
say, yeah, your offer's accepted, can you pop me the proof of funds through? You can say, oh yeah, 3 weeks. No good,
No,
you've
no.
lost it. You've
So
got to have it.
let me ask you another question, because we touched on, based on your question, the question of financing. Is it necessarily a disadvantage if you're funding 60 or 70% of the project? I mean, you don't have to be a cash purchaser, presumably.
No.
But show yourself as a cash purchaser.
Can you explain that?
You can always tell them that you're a cash agent, because bridging is almost like cash anyway.
So tell them you're a cash purchaser even if you're not.
Well,
Wow. Okay.
You're
There's a few
paying the
tucks
cash.
in the room over there.
bridging is cash.
Well, what you're saying is it doesn't matter whose cash
Doesn't
it
matter,
is.
doesn't matter.
Who's cash?
Actually, I think the one point I'd say, if I look back to the first, I would say, as Richie touched on this, go for low-hanging fruit. Go for a simple, easy, straightforward project, okay? Something that you know. So I'll give you
And don't overstretch.
Don't overstretch. So I'll give you a very quick example. I bought there was a shop I bought in Surbiton, Kingston upon Thames. I'm not sure if anyone knows that part of the world. This shop had been empty for almost 6.5 years, okay? And it was actually owned by a solicitor. And I went in there and I saw an opportunity. because the rear of the property was basically was a rubbish tip. But one key thing is it had rear access, and that's where I thought there's an opportunity for me to build another asset at the back. So effectively, as a long shop, I basically reduce the size of the shop, take some of that space, build something at the back, and create a residential unit on a shop and upper situation. Long story short, I bought that for £305,000, right? He bought that shop in 2008 for £320,000. So I paid him less than he paid for it 10 years earlier, right? Secondly, I got it subject to planning. So he agreed on that because I had, this was before PD.
And you exchange contracts subject to?
I exchanged contracts subject to planning on the basis if I get planning, all good. If I don't get planning, all bets off, and I get my return on my deposit.
So you had nothing to lose?
I had nothing to lose, right? This is all about negotiating, right? So the key thing there is you go in there. See, the key thing is go in there with a plan, know what you're doing, work with a good planning consultant. And this was during COVID. And the lovely thing about it was when I rang up the planning officer, his dog was barking or his baby was screaming in the background, and he was always apologizing. So I knew I was onto a winner anyway. And I got planning in 10 weeks, okay? Long story short, we got planning to build a 2-bedroom, single-story residential property at the back, which was valued. It cost me £140,000 to do the whole conversion for the new build and putting the shop shell in. The shop, the flat or the 2-bedroom apartment at the back was valued at £580,000. Okay, so I got all my money back just on the residential alone. I then shipped up the commercial shop. And I play a little bit of a trick with, a lot of you will know about business rates, and I play a very clever game with the VOA. So that whenever I create a residential shop, as you probably know, most of the reason why commercial landlords have been hit very hard is even if the shop is empty, empty business rates has been abolished, they still have to pay full business rates even if they're not trading. And that's what's crucifying a lot of the commercial landlords today. So the key thing you've got to remember, and again, I'm sorry, I'm going a bit diverse.
Right, we get to the next thing. Come on.
Yeah, We'll come out there. But if what I'll do is anyone wants to touch on that, the key thing that is my end value for the shop and the back was £850,000 on a £300,000 investment in 6 months. You're not going to get a better deal than that anywhere. So effectively, I've got an unencumbered shop, which is giving me £20,000 a year rent, and that 2-bedroom apartment at the back, which was a rubbish tip, now gives me £2,200 a month. Rent.
Let's talk about planning consultants, because we've mentioned planning consultants a few times. Unless you've got something you want to add to that, or
When we mentioned the add-on, you might have your PD conversion. There's also plenty that you can do, and I get a lot of inquiries come through the door. Can I do Class MA? Can I do Class G on this? And because of the restrictions, for whatever reason, they don't work. But that doesn't mean the potential's not there. Yeah. Sometimes there's enormous potential. You just have to go the plan.
James, that brings me to my question. So we talked about planning consultants quite a bit, and obviously there are planning consultants that specialise in planning. My question is, how do you know that they're also PD experts? Because they're two different things. So these guys go out now and start saying, right, I know what I'm going to buy. I'm going to enlist the help of a planning consultant. What should they be looking for in a planning consultant where they can have confidence and assurance that that planning consultant really understands this complexity of permitted development? Apart from just saying, well, come to me, which obviously you're going to say.
You could be clever and find out a little fact or something about permitted development and ask them a question to see whether or not you can catch them out on the answer.
Test them, yeah.
You can ask them what previous projects they've done, what experience they've got. You can also ask them what their background is. In my experience, I worked probably equal share in private and public sector. You can ask them what their public sector experience is, because as a baby planner, as a junior planner, you tend to get put on the PD stuff.
And also their relationship, presumably, with the local authority would be important.
Not so much.
Should we use the local one?
Well, because of that potential relationship, yeah.
5-10 years ago, I would say local experience with councils is really valuable. And it does still have some value. But in today's planning world, at least probably 50% of the planners in our planning department are going to be on a 3-month contract. They circulate regularly. It's very difficult to build up a rapport with your local planning department in the way that you could have done sort of 10 years ago.
Yeah.
When I started, you used to get them into the cafe, we'd sit around a table and draw out a plan on the table with the applicant. That doesn't exist anymore. So yes, some local experience is useful, but it's not really as important as it
I think the other thing as well I do is what Manny touched on earlier is go to property network groups and speak to people who are doing it.
Yeah.
Right? Speak to other developers like yourself who've worked with different planners in different areas, with different successes and stuff. And generally, you find within that network group that everyone tends to go to the same solicitors, to the same accountants, to the same planning consultants. It's like a little family. We do one where we have 100 people in that room every day, and pretty much the same group. And there's a lot of discussion about successes and failures. And a lot of the time, what worked, and more important, what didn't it work? Why didn't it work?
Well, you
And
can
that
learn.
shit,
You can learn from other people's failures.
You learn
yeah.
a lot of that. You learn a lot.
So, any other? Because we've got 4 minutes left, I think. So, any other questions? Any observations? Any comments?
How do you guys calculate your deals? Based on the GDP profit, or by how you structure? How basically do your calculations?
In terms of what do you mean? Do you assume that you're going to get
for example,
the permitted
how much
development?
What's your
What margin?
Yeah, margins or square footage per conversion or whatever.
Ritchie?
How you
Margin, you want 20% on gross development value, minimum. The actual cost of the development, unknown, okay, because it depends what it is. You could be buying a light industrial building, which is hardly anything there, or the bank building. The conversion cost of those to residential could vary wildly across the country, and the standard that you do varies wildly. What you actually need is a cost consultant, quantity surveyor in the industry to work alongside you to price up those individual schemes. But the most important thing you want to think about is a 20% margin. That's what you've got to start out with, minimum.
I'd say you'd say maybe 25 even, but that's after finance costs as well. So you need to factor in.
and
nowadays,
stamp duty. You can't forget about
the
the
finance
on
cost right now is huge, so you're going to make sure you go, whether it's
so
a
it's
private
still 20%
finance.
in current market is still 20%.
Minimum.
Minimum, yeah.
And as Manny says, maybe towards 25. You've got to look, and you as an entrepreneur have got to predict what the future is going to be. That's why you come and listen to panels like this, and then you've got to decide whether this is a 20 or 25%. Last night I was at an event and someone said, "I've been told you should price in 40% margin," and I said, "Well, good luck. 'Cause
Good
you're
luck
not
buying
doing any
something."
jobs."
Yeah.
And I think for conversions, we're doing about £150 per square foot on conversion. It's just the internal spec.
Your
That
cost.
doesn't include windows. It doesn't include any roof works. All of that.
I think, like I said, which is very, 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 very important point. Every project is different.
Yeah, I know. That's
Every
right,
project is
because I know
different.
you used
And not
it's
that
a ballpark.
geographically, see,
1,200 per square
the
meter.
thing is you've got to take into consideration is material cost, labour cost, logistics cost. Remember, there are some sites where you can't get a crane on there. You can't get, because at the end of the day, the council will ask you for a construction methodology statement. Okay, what you're going to do? Where's rubbish going to be collected? Are you going to disturb the neighbouring properties? Da 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 da. So you got. There are some sites where somewhere in central London, parking there is about 100 quid a day, right? Yeah, and so a lot of the time you've got to. When you go into a project, you've got to always price this in. Sometimes you think I've got a great deal on paper, and then suddenly when you start putting the methodology statement together, you think, hang on a minute.
Yeah, don't kid yourself on the numbers.
Yeah.
Right, guys, we've got to wrap up, I'm afraid. That hour has whizzed by. Can I just ask for a quick show of hands? How many people in the room now feel a bit more enthusiastic about tackling a permitted development project? I think we've succeeded, ladies and gentlemen.
Good.
Well done. Right, so thank you to the panel, please. That's been very informative. Thank you to you.